3 years after the awakening, the colony ship Perseverance finally limped into orbit around New Eden. Its hull scarred by the long journey, and its crew forever changed by what they had endured. The story of their resurrection had spread across known space like fire through dry grass, carried by deep space communications, and whispered in the halls of alien civilizations that had never paid attention to humanity before an immortal had sacrificed eternity for mortals. The universe had never seen anything like it. The Ethery Council responded to the news with fear disguised as anger, declaring Seraphil's act an abomination and proof that humanity's emotional contamination was even more dangerous than they had believed. They sealed their borders and retreated from all contact with human space, terrified that other Ethery might be infected by the same madness that had claimed their youngest member. But other species were not so afraid. The Velith, still recovering from their own 10,000 years of stone imprisonment, sent ambassadors to New Eden within months of the Perseverance's arrival, eager to meet the species that had inspired an immortal to rebel. Your kind did something our kind never could, the Velith ambassador told Elias during their first meeting. You made them feel, and that is the most dangerous weapon in the universe. The Keepers, ancient collectors of knowledge who had remained neutral in all galactic affairs for millions of years, opened their library worlds to human scholars for the first time in recorded history. We wish to understand, the Keeper archivists explained, how a species so young and so brief can burn so brightly. A dozen other civilizations reached out in the years that followed, species that had spent millennia hiding from the Etheries. Judgment, now emboldened by the proof that the Immortals could be challenged, humanity had not just survived, humanity had changed the galaxy. On New Eden, the survivors of the Perseverance built their colony with a determination that bordered on obsession, constructing homes and schools and hospitals and parks as if they were racing against time itself. In a way they were. One of them had spent nearly 3 years trapped in stone, conscious but helpless, dreaming of the lives they might never live. And now they refused to waste a single moment. Elias Varn became the colony's leader, not because he sought power, but because the people trusted him, because they remembered how he had tried to protect a stranger's child in the face of extinction. He led with compassion and wisdom, making decisions that prioritize community over profit and connection over expansion. And under his guidance, New Eden flourished, and always at his side was Seraphil. Former immortal had aged quickly in her new mortal form, her hair turning gray within the first year and lines appearing on her face that told the story of a soul learning what it meant to be temporary. She found the experience terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. I used to watch sunsets from the observation deck of Ethery vessels, she told Elias one evening as they stood together on a hillside overlooking the colony. I witnessed 10 billion of them across 1,000 different worlds, and I cannot remember a single one. She reached for his hand and held it tight. But I will remember this sunset for the rest of my life, because I know it is one of a limited number, because I know that each one brings me closer to the end. Elias squeezed her fingers gently. Does that frighten you? Every moment of every day, Seraphil admitted. But I have learned that fear is not the opposite of courage. It is the source of it. She turned to look at him with eyes that no longer held galaxies, but held something more precious. Something human. You taught me that, Elias Varn, with your smile in the face of oblivion. 20 years passed and the colony grew from a collection of temporary shelters into a thriving city, with children who had never known the stone playing in streets named after the survivors who had built them. Emma, the little girl Elias had tried to protect, grew up to become a pilot just as she had always dreamed, flying supply ships between New Eden and the other human colonies that had sprouted across the sector she never forgot the man who had held her in the darkness, or the woman who had brought her back to the light. Seraphal's body weakened as the years went by, her mortal form failing in ways that no Ethery had ever experienced. And she faced each new limitation with a grace that amazed everyone who knew her. "I lived for 40,000 years," she told Elias on the morning of her final day, her voice barely a whisper, "and I cannot remember a single moment that mattered until I met you and your people." She lay in their bed in the small house they had built together, surrounded by friends and family and the children and grandchildren of the people she had saved. "Do you regret it?" Elias asked, as he had asked 1,000 times over the years. "Giving up eternity for this," Seraphel smiled. And it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I had forever, and it was empty. But these 60 years have been so full that I could not hold another moment if I tried." She reached up and touched his weathered face. "This is what your species understands that mine never did. That limitation creates meaning, that endings give value to beginnings, that love is only possible when loss is real." Her eyes began to close. "Thank you, Elias, for teaching an immortal how to live." She passed quietly as the sun rose over New Eden, surrounded by the people she loved. And the grief that followed was matched only by the gratitude for the life she had chosen. They built a monument in the center of the colony. 2 figures carved from white stone and holding hands. One that had been human, and one that had chosen to become human. The inscription at the base was simple, but true. "She had forever, but she chose us instead. And in 60 years, she lived more than eternity could offer, because this is what it means to be human. Not the length of our days, but the depth of our love." Visitors came from across the galaxy to see the monument. Velith and keepers and species whose names humanity could not pronounce. All drawn by the story of an immortal who had learned the most human lesson of all, that life is not about how long you exist, it is about how deeply you feel it is. About who you love and who loves you. It is about choosing compassion over survival and connection over safety in others. Over self. The Ethery watched from their sealed borders as humanity spread across the stars, carrying with them the legacy of Seraphel's sacrifice and the message that even gods could learn from mortals. And somewhere in the eternal light where immortal consciousnesses drifted in endless observation, a few young Ethery began to wonder if their kind had made a terrible mistake, if perhaps the humans were not a contamination to be feared, but a cure for a sickness they had not known they carried. The story of Seraphel and Elias and the 1,000 Days of Stone became legend, then myth, then something close to scripture, but the truth at its heart remained unchanged across the centuries. Love is worth more than forever, and humanity had proven it to the stars. Elias Varin's first breath in 1,000 days felt like fire and ice and starlight all mixed together, and he collapsed to the deck of the observation platform as his body remembered what it meant to be flesh. Instead of stone, his lungs screamed for air, and his heart pounded against his ribs, and his muscles burned with the effort of simply staying conscious. But none of that mattered, because he was alive. He was alive all around him. Elias heard the sounds of other humans waking from their stone prison, crying and screaming and laughing and calling out names of people they loved. And the chorus of voices was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. But something else caught his attention. Woman lay on the floor before him, curled up on her side with her arms wrapped around herself. And she was trembling like a leaf in a storm. She looked almost human, with pale skin and dark hair and a face that seemed both ancient and young at the same time. But there was something strange about her, something that suggested she had not always worn this form. "You," Elias rasped, his voice rough from years of silence. And somehow he knew her even though they had never truly met. He remembered a presence in the darkness, a voice speaking to him through the endless night of his imprisonment. a light that had kept him from losing his mind to the isolation. "You talk to me," he said, crawling toward her on hands and knees that shook with effort. "Every day, for years. You talked to me, and I heard you." The woman opened her eyes and looked at him. And Elias saw galaxies dying in those eyes. Saw infinity fading into something smaller and more precious. "Seraphel," she whispered, her voice as rough as his own. "My name was Seraphel, was?" She tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace of pain. "I am something new now, something I do not fully understand. Something mortal." She held up her hand and stared at it with a mixture of wonder and terror, flexing fingers that had never known the weight of flesh before. "I have perhaps 60 years if this body holds together. Maybe less, where once I had forever." Elias stared at her as understanding slowly dawned in his mind, as he pieced together what she had done and what it must have cost her. "You saved us," he said, "all 2,400 of us. You brought us back from the stone. I did what needed to be done. You gave up eternity." Seraphel met his eyes, and in that moment, Elias saw the truth of what she had sacrificed. Saw the weight of immortality falling away from her shoulders. Saw the fear and joy and uncertainty of a being who had never known what it meant to have an ending. "Why?" he demanded. Because he needed to understand, needed to know what could possibly drive an immortal to choose death. "Why would you do that for us, for strangers? For a species your people condemned as too dangerous to exist?" Seraphel was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was soft and wondering. "Because you smiled." "What?" "At the end of everything, facing oblivion, knowing that you would spend eternity trapped in stone. You smiled." She reached out and touched his face with fingers that trembled. "You showed me that meaning is not found in duration, but in depth. That a single moment of true compassion is worth more than 1,000,000 years of empty observation." Tears began to fall down her cheeks, and she laughed in surprise at the sensation. "Your species lives such brief lives, and yet you feel more in a single day than my kind felt in eons. And I wanted to understand that. I wanted to experience it for myself." Elias took her hand in his, steadying her trembling fingers. "You saved 2,400 people. I saved myself," Seraphel corrected quietly. "You saved me first, with your smile, with your courage, with your choice to comfort a stranger's child instead of begging for your own life." Around them, the ship was coming alive as the survivors organized themselves, as engineers checked systems that had been dormant for nearly 3 years. As families found each other and wept with joy, Elias heard a child's voice calling out somewhere below, and he recognized it as the little girl he had tried to protect. "Emma," he said, struggling to his feet and pulling Seraphel up with him. "The girl I was holding when the stone took us." "Is she? She's alive," Seraphel said. "They're all alive. Everyone you were trying to save." Elias felt tears streaming down his own face now, and he did not try to hide them. "Can you walk?" Seraphel took a tentative step and nearly fell, her new legs unused to bearing weight. But Elias caught her and held her steady. "I will learn," she said. "I have 60 years to figure out how to be human, and I intend to use every moment." Together they made their way through the corridors of the Perseverance, past crying families and laughing friends and people kneeling in prayer and people simply standing still and breathing. Because breathing was a miracle they had almost lost forever. They found Emma in the cargo hold, wrapped in her mother's arms, sobbing with a joy that seemed too big for her small body to contain. "You saved her," Emma's mother said when she saw Elias approaching. "The crew told me what you did, how you tried to protect her in the final moments. I only did what anyone would do." "No," the mother said, her voice fierce with emotion. "Not anyone. Not the beings who did this to us, only someone human." Elias looked at Seraphel, at this former immortal who had given up everything to give them back their lives. And he understood what the mother meant. Humanity was not about biology or lifespan or the shape of a body. It was about choosing compassion over survival, love over safety, others over self. She is human too, Elias said, nodding towards Seraphel. More human than most. Emma looked up at the strange woman with curious eyes. Are you an angel? Seraphel knelt down to the child's level, moving carefully in her unfamiliar body. No, little one, I am just someone who made a choice. What kind of choice? Seraphel reached out and gently touched Emma's cheek. The same cheek that had been pressed against Elias's chest when the stone took them both. I chose to believe that some things are worth more than forever. Emma did not fully understand, but she hugged Seraphel anyway, and the former immortal held the child with arms that had never known warmth until today. Elias watched them and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been broken for 1,000 days finally beginning to heal. They had been given a second chance, all of them, and he was going to make sure they used it well. Seraphel searched through the ethery archives for months, diving into knowledge that had been buried for millions of years, reading records that spoke of judgments and punishments from before the stars themselves were. Born on day 912, she found what she was looking for, and the discovery shattered everything she thought she knew about her people. The stone tide was not permanent. The council had lied deep in the oldest section of the archives, protected by barriers that should have been impossible to breach. Seraphel found records of another species called the Velith who had been punished with petrification. 10 million years ago, the Velith had been dreamers and builders, creators of beautiful things that challenged the ethery's belief in their own superiority. And for that crime, they had been turned to stone just as humans had been. But the record showed that after 10,000 years, the Velith had been released, their spirits broken by millennia of conscious imprisonment, their civilization reduced to hollow shells that pose no threat to anyone. The body of civilization reduced to hollow shells that pose no threat to anyone. Stonetide was not a permanent sentence, but a tool of destruction, designed to crush the soul while leaving the body intact. And the ethery had used it knowing full well that freedom would eventually come. They just wanted the victims to suffer. First, Seraphel felt rage building in her chest, hot and unfamiliar, as she understood the true cruelty of what her people had done. But the rage faded quickly when she found the second piece of information hidden in the ancient files. There was a way to end the stone tide early, and ethery could trade their immortality, their connection to the eternal light that gave them life, to break the petrification curse before its natural end. The mathematics were simple and brutal. One immortal life could free one mortal from the stone, which meant that saving all 2,400 humans would require 2,400 ethery willing to sacrifice themselves. That would never happen. Ethery valued their eternal existence above all things, and not a single member of the council would give up even a moment of their infinity for creatures they considered primitive. But there was another option buried in the fine print of the ancient texts. A single ethery could channel everything they were, every particle of light and every thread of consciousness, into one cataclysmic release of energy that would shatter all the stone at once. It would not simply kill the ethery who performed it would erase them completely. No after echo in the eternal light, where ethery souls lingered after their physical forms faded. No memory preserved in the cosmic consciousness of their kind. No trace that they had ever existed at all. Complete and total annihilation. The one thing that immortals feared above all else. Seraphel sat alone in the archives for 88 days, thinking about what she had learned and what it would mean to act on that knowledge. She thought about Elias Varan smiling as the stone consumed him, giving his last moment of freedom to comfort a child he had never met. She thought about little Emma dreaming alone in the cargo hold, Reaching for a mother who could not hold her, she thought about 2,400 humans who had done nothing wrong except feel too deeply and love too strongly and dream too boldly. And she thought about herself. About the 40,000 years she had spent observing without participating, judging without understanding, existing without truly living. What was immortality worth if it was empty? What was eternity worth if it was spent watching others suffer? On day 999, Seraphil made her way through the silent ship one final time, visiting each of the frozen humans and speaking their names aloud. Sarah Chun, who healed the sick and never stopped searching for answers. Marcus Webb, who built engines that could carry dreams across the stars. Yuki Tanaka, who believed that teaching children was the most important work in the universe. Emma, who wanted to be a pilot and see the wonders of space with her own eyes. And finally, she came to the observation deck where Elias stood frozen with his gentle smile, and she pressed her luminous hand against his cold stone cheek. Elias Varan, who taught an immortal what it truly means to live. Seraphil felt tears forming in her eyes, something that should have been impossible for a being of pure light. And she let them fall without shame. I have existed for 40,000 years, she whispered, and I cannot remember a single moment that mattered until I met you. She stepped back and looked at all the frozen faces around her, all the dreams trapped in stone, all the love waiting to be freed. The council will say I am insane, that no immortal should sacrifice eternity for creatures who will die in a century anyway, that my existence is worth more than all of yours combined. Her light began to pulse brighter, gathering energy from the core of her being. But they are wrong. She thought of the universe she would never see again, the galaxies she would never visit, the millions of years she would never experience, and then she thought of Emma waking up and running into her mother's arms. She thought of Elias opening his eyes and taking his first breath in almost 3 years. She thought of 2,400 humans getting a second chance to live and love and dream. Choose you, Seraphil said, her voice ringing through the silent ship like a bell. I choose all of you, and I give everything I am so that you might live. The light inside her chest exploded outward in day. 1,000 Seraphil poured every particle of her immortal existence into a single blazing moment of sacrifice. The energy ripped through the perseverance like a wave of liquid sunshine, touching every statue, filling every crack, warming every frozen heart. And as the light consumed her, as her consciousness began to fade into nothing, Seraphil felt something she had never experienced in 40 millennia of existence. She felt at peace. Her last thought before the darkness took her was not of fear or regret. It was of Elias Varin's smile, and of how much she hoped to see him open his eyes. And there was nothing. And then, impossibly, wonderfully, there was everything all across the ship. The stone began to crack. The first 100 days passed slowly for Seraphil as she drifted through the silent corridors of the Perseverance, her luminous form casting soft light across the faces of frozen humans who dreamed their endless stone dreams. She told herself that she stayed for scientific reasons, that humanity was an anomaly worth studying, that understanding their strange emotional depths would benefit the Ethery Council in future judgments. But deep in her heart, she knew those were lies. She stayed because of him. Every day Seraphil returned to the observation deck where Commander Elias Varin stood frozen in his final act of compassion. And every day she found herself speaking to him as though he could hear her words. Your species confuses me, she said on day 47, her voice echoing in the empty chamber. You live for such a short time, barely 100 years if you are fortunate, and yet you waste those precious moments caring for strangers and dreaming impossible dreams. The statue did not respond, but Seraphil continued anyway. The Ethery live forever, And we have learned that attachment brings only pain, that caring for others is inefficient, that the universe functions best when observed from a distance. Without interference, she reached out and let her fingers hover near his stone cheek. Not quite touching, but you, Elias Varan. You ran toward a child you did not know, and you smiled as eternity swallowed you whole. And I cannot stop thinking about why. The days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to months. And Seraphel found her visits growing longer each time she began to tell him about herself, about her long existence among the immortals, about the emptiness that had always lived in her chest, but that she had never acknowledged until now. I was created 40,000 years ago, she said on day 156, formed from the light of a dying star and given consciousness by the Elder Council. And I have spent every moment since then observing and judging and existing without ever truly living. She sat down beside his frozen form, something the Aetheri never did, for sitting was a mortal habit born from bodies that grew tired. I have seen wonders that would break your human mind. Elias, galaxies colliding in slow motion over millions of years, stars being born in clouds of cosmic dust, civilizations rising and falling like waves upon a shore. Her voice grew soft, but I have never felt wonder myself, never experienced the joy of discovery or the warmth of connection, because the Aetheri believe that feelings make us weak. She looked up at his face, at that gentle smile frozen forever in stone, watching you in your final moment. I felt something, and it frightened me more than anything in 40 millennia. As the months passed, Seraphel began to learn things about the frozen humans that she had not expected. Though their bodies were stone, their minds remained active, dreaming in an endless twilight between sleep and waking. And Seraphel discovered that she could sense the edges of their dreams if she focused hard enough. She felt the mother in Corridor 7, dreaming of her children. The old scientist in the laboratory, dreaming of discoveries he would never make. The young couple in the passenger quarters, dreaming of the wedding they had planned to hold on New Eden, and she felt the little girl in the cargo hold, the child Elias had tried to save, dreaming of her mother's voice and her father's arms and a home she would never see again. The weight of 2,400 stolen lives pressed down on Seraphel's consciousness. And for the first time in her immortal existence, she felt something that might have been guilt. I did not cast the judgment, she whispered to Elias on day 234. But I did nothing to stop it either, and my silence makes me as responsible as those who spoke the words. She began spending time with the other statues too, learning their names from the ship's records, piecing together their stories from personal logs and photographs and half-finished letters. There was Dr. Sarah Chen, who had dedicated her life to finding cures for diseases that plagued distant colonies, and engineer Marcus Webb, who had designed the Perseverance's engines with his own hands, and teacher Yuki Tanaka, who had volunteered to educate the children during the long voyage to New Eden. Each of them had dreams and hopes and people who loved them, and each of them had been silenced by the cold judgment of beings who had forgotten what it meant to feel. We thought we were gods, Seraphel said on day 401, standing in the cargo hold among the scattered statues of children. We thought our immortality gave us the right to decide who deserved to exist and who deserved to suffer. But we were wrong. She found the little girl Elias had tried to protect, her small stone face still wet with tears that would never dry, her arms still reaching for a mother who stood frozen 3 decks above. Her name is Emma, Seraphel said, reading the identification tag on the girl's dress. She is 7 years old, and she wanted to be a pilot when she grew up. And now she will dream alone in the darkness forever, because my people decided that humanity felt too much. The guilt transformed into something harder, something with edges, and Seraphel began to wonder if there was anything she could do to undo the horror her kind had inflicted on day 500. She returned to the observation deck and sat beside Elias with new determination. In her ancient heart, I am going to find a way to save you, she promised. All of you, every single human on this ship. Because what we did was wrong, and someone must make it right. She did not know yet what that would cost her. She did not know that the price of 2,400 lives would be paid in the currency of eternity itself. But she knew that she could not simply watch anymore, could not float through the silent corridors pretending that observation was enough, could not spend another 40,000 years existing without living. Elias Varn had taught her something in his final moment. A lesson that his smile had carved into her immortal soul life was not measured in years, but in moments. Not in duration, but in depth. Not in what you witnessed, but in what you chose to don't. Seraphel chose to act. She began searching the vast archives of ethery knowledge, diving deep into records that had not been accessed in millennia, looking for any hint of how the stone tide might be reversed. The council had said the sentence was eternal, but Seraphel had lived long enough to know that immortals often lied. And somewhere in the forgotten corners of her people's history, there had to be an answer. She would find it, she would save them, or she would spend the rest of eternity trying. Hold on. Elias, she whispered as day 500 faded into day 501. Hold on, Emma, and Sarah, and Marcus, and Yuki, and all of you whose names I am still learning. Her light pulsed brighter in the darkness. I am coming for you. Commander Elias Varane stood on the bridge of the colony ship, Perseverance, and watched the alien vessel approach through the darkness of space. His heart beating fast as he realized that humanity was about to meet its first extraterrestrial civilization. The ship that came toward them was not made of metal or glass or anything Elias could understand, but rather it seemed to be woven from pure light itself, shifting and flowing like liquid gold against the black canvas of the void. All crew to stations, Elias commanded through the ship's communication system. His voice steady, even though fear crawled through his chest like cold fingers. The Perseverance carried 2,400 souls across the stars. Families and scientists and dreamers, all seeking a new home on a distant world called New Eden. And now they floated helpless before beings that could reshape light itself. Within minutes, the aliens made contact. Not through radio waves or signals, but directly into the minds of every human aboard the ship. We are the ethery. The voice said, echoing in Elias's skull like thunder in a canyon. And we have watched your kind for many cycles. Elias gripped the railing of the command platform as images flooded his brain. Visions of the ethery observing Earth from the shadows of space. Watching humanity crawl from caves to cities to starships in what seemed like mere moments to immoral eyes. You burn too bright. The voice continued, and your emotions spread like fire through dry grass, contaminating everything you touch. We mean no harm. Elias spoke aloud, hoping they could hear him. We only seek a new home for our people. The ethery did not respond with words, but with judgment. Elias felt the verdict crash into his consciousness like a wave against rocks. And he understood with horrible clarity what was about to happen to his people. You are sentenced to the stone tide, the ethery declared, and you will drift through the void for eternity as a warning to other species who burn as you. Dew screams erupted throughout the ship as the petrification wave began at the outer hull and moved inward, like a spreading frost, turning everything it touched into cold gray stone. Elias watched in horror as his crew members froze mid-step, their faces locked in expressions of terror and confusion, their bodies becoming statues in the span of a heartbeat. He had only seconds left through the chaos. Elias spotted a small girl standing alone in the corridor below the bridge, tears streaming down her face as she called for her mother. And without thinking, he threw himself down the stairs toward her. The stone wave was coming fast now, turning the walls and floor into cold rock. And Elias knew he would not escape it. But he could still do one thing. He reached the girl and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her small body against his chest and shielding her face with his hand. "It is okay," he whispered to her as the cold began to creep up his legs. "I have got you, so close your eyes." The girl buried her face in his uniform, and Elias felt the petrification climbing his spine, turning his flesh to stone inch by terrible inch. In his final moment of freedom, he thought of his wife back on Earth, of the letters he would never send, of the life he would never live. And somehow through all that grief and fear, he found something unexpected: peace. He had lived a good life. He had loved deeply, and his last act would be one of compassion for a stranger's child, as the stone consumed his face. Elias Varan smiled far above in the ethery vessel. One of the immortal beings watched this moment with eyes that had seen galaxies born and die. And something shifted in her ancient heart. Her name was Seraphil, youngest of the Immortal Council and only 40,000 years old. And she had been assigned to study humanity before their sentence was carried out. She had observed humans for many months, cataloging their strange behaviors and powerful emotions. But nothing had prepared her for what she witnessed in Commander Elias Varanthman had faced: eternal torment, and his first thought was to comfort a child he did not even know. He had smiled. Seraphil could not understand it, could not process how a creature with such a brief lifespan could possess such depths of courage and compassion. The ethery did not feel as humans did, for emotions were considered primitive things that faded away as a species evolved toward immortality. Yet watching Elias freeze with that gentle smile on his face made Seraphil feel something she had no name for. The council completed their work quickly, separating the 2,400 human statues and scattering them throughout the ship as additional cruelty, ensuring that families would spend eternity apart, unable to see or touch or comfort one another. The child Elias had tried to protect was taken from his frozen arms and placed in the lower cargo hold, alone among strangers, dreaming her stone dreams far from anyone who loved her. Seraphil watched all of this and felt the nameless feeling grow stronger in her chest. "We depart now," the eldest council member announced. "There are other galaxies to observe, and this matter is concluded." The other ethery began to fade from the vessel, their light forms dissolving as they traveled across impossible distances to their next judgment. But Seraphil did not follow. "I will remain," she said, "to ensure the sentence holds and to continue my studies of this species." The council did not argue, for what did it matter if one young ethery wished to watch over a ship full of statues? And so they left her alone in the darkness between stars. Arafel drifted down through the silent ship, past frozen humans caught in their final moments of terror and hope and love, until she found herself standing before Commander Elias Varan. His stone face still held that impossible smile. "Why?" Seraphil whispered, though she knew he could not answer. "Why did you not beg for your own life as others did? And why did you run toward danger instead of away from it?" The statue gave no response. But Seraphil could not bring herself to leave. She had watched countless species face extinction over her long existence, had seen empires crumble and worlds burn, and never once had she felt compelled to linger. But something about humanity was different. Something about this one man with his gentle smile and his arms still reaching for a child he could not save had planted a seed in Seraphil's immortal heart. She did not know what that seed would grow into. She did not know that over the next 1,000 days she would learn more about life and love and meaning than she had learned in 40,000 years of existence. She only knew that she could not leave him alone in the dark, and so Seraphil began her vigil. The immortal watching over the mortal, the being of light keeping company with a man of stone. As the ship called Perseverance drifted silently through the endless void toward a destiny neither of them could have imagined.